This sound file is for the start of the field trip at University of Waterloo, Stop 1. Welcome everyone to the digital Uptown Waterloo field trip. You'll interact with this field trip by listening to the audio files and watching the video files. Look at the question and answer sheet as we go and take a few brief notes. Please let me know if you have any questions. So we'll be walking from the University of Waterloo through Waterloo Park to Uptown Waterloo on this digital field trip. This area has been primarily developed since it was settled in the early 1800s, and before that it was variously used as hunting grounds by indigenous nations including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee and neutral peoples. The Anishinaabe lived along the Grand River in the 1600s, and this whole area is along the Holdeman Tract, 6 miles either side of the Grand River promised to the Six Nations. We'll discuss the Indigenous and Haudenosaunee history further next week, and we'll talk about it more on the Elora field trip too. Much of this area was developed much more recently than the 1980s, however, with a lot of development happening in the 1960s. The University of Waterloo, where we are now, was built in 1959. Though one of the colleges across the creek, St. Jerome's, is significantly older, established in 1865, though it wasn't located in this area until much later, until the late 1950s, and was located in Wilmot and later in Berlin, which is now Kitchener. Our route largely follows the Laurel Creek, which flows into the Grand River from the north of campus, from the Laurel Creek Conservation Area, through the university, through the park, and under Uptown Waterloo. I'll point out several key things about the management of the creek along the way, and we'll think more about these themes when we visit Elora Gorge later in the term, and measure the creek's velocity on campus toward the end of term. But one important thing about these field trips is thinking about how the natural environment is managed and intersects with human landscapes too. Before we start our walk, you'll watch the video that takes you from stop 1 to stop 2. I want to note something about a particular way of seeing and a way of taking note of what's around us on this field trip and on other field trips. This is called reading the landscape. It's a key method, or perhaps a preliminary way of collecting data in geography for both human and physical geographers. So this idea is called reading the landscape. It's often described as a method or way of seeing in a critical way, looking for important features of the physical and built environment that might give a hint as to how they were formed or why they are there. Looking might be a great first step before you start to take measurements or do other kinds of research. And of course, not everything is visible to the human eye, but simply looking can tell us a lot, or it might help us to start asking questions in a geographical way. For example, why is this here and not somewhere else? How did this feature of the landscape form? What's its history and geography? In physical geography, this might involve looking carefully at different kinds of vegetation, at the patterns of erosion along a river, stream or creek, at noticing where the light hits a surface at different times of the day, in seeing what's growing where. Looking in this way can help you to think through patterns. Why is this kind of vegetation growing here but not here? Why is erosion occurring in this particular pattern? If you can start to identify patterns, you might be able to start to identify why those patterns occur and understand the underlying processes that lead to the formation of those patterns. Remember though, even when we're looking at biophysical features of the environment, there is very little that isn't directly affected by human intervention and management too, especially in urban and park spaces. This will even be true in a less obviously human environment like Elora Gorge, or even in more rural and remote areas. This is what geographers will call the social construction of nature. The idea that the natural environment, so-called, I would use air quotes around natural here, the natural environment is also produced in large part by human intervention. And further than that, the concept of nature itself, or in other words, what's supposedly natural versus unnatural, is itself a human idea. Nature doesn't itself have a concept of what's natural or unnatural, of course. Nature is something that humans use to describe particular kinds of environments. And so the idea of nature itself is to some extent socially constructed and socially produced. In terms of human geographical ways of seeing the landscape, human geographers often see the landscape as a representation of dominant power relations in a given area. Landscape has an ideological function that seeks to reflect and reproduce the norms and values of those in power. Essentially, this is about looking for who or what is prioritized in the landscape around us, in the visual landscape that is. Whose point of view and whose values are represented here in this place. There are some very obvious examples of this. For example, statues, plaques, plinths, historical preservation, whose names are on the side of buildings, and so on. But it might be seen in less obvious ways too. Who is able to control our visual plane in this space? What is prioritized through what we can see? In many ways, this is about looking for historical aspects of the landscape that give evidence of how power is distributed in the area. For example, what can we actually see in this area is evidence of settlers and settlements since the early 1800s, but very little of the indigenous people who lived on and used this land before us is visual in the landscape. But of course, indigenous people lived on this land, used it, hunted on it for millennia before settlers arrived and started occupying this land. So what we're able to see is not necessarily a kind of objective or neutral description of a historical record or of the layers of history that came before, and in fact is very closely curated and managed and produced in a very particular way by a very particular group of people. Often what we see is a reflection of who's able to spend money in an area, or who kind of is able to have control over the visual landscape through spending that money. And we'll see many, many examples of this as we walk through Waterloo Park and into Uptown. So often what we can see in urban spaces reflects who has money, control and power in a given area. Okay, that's all I want to say for this stop, but we'll return to this idea of reading the landscape, looking for particular iconographical features of the landscape as we move through this field trip through Waterloo Park to Uptown Waterloo. Okay, so next you can take a look at the short video that takes you from stop 1 to stop 2, and then I will talk to you again at the next stop.